All right, guys, let's get into period 7, part 2, looking at the 1920s, the Great Depression, the New Deal, and World War II. We had left off with part 1 as the United States was coming out of World War I, looking to, as Warren Harding put it, return to normalcy as a way of returning to a pro-business, more isolated foreign policy government that was limited and not as progressive as before. So moving into the 1920s, we're going to see the legacy of that election, the election of 1920, and how that will lead us into the Great Depression. When you think about the 20s, I think what most people think about when they think about the 20s is the term the Roaring 20s. All right, that the 20s was a huge time for economic boom and prosperity, especially for the urban cities, the retail centers, the industrial sectors. You have a lot of growth in the 1920s due to various factors. One of the biggest ones is all the stuff that the progressives had done in the 19 teens, the regulation, the reforming of capitalism had created economic conditions that would help spur on growth, especially the inclusion of scientific management, the bureaucratic revolution of the late 19th and early 20th century, the creation of professionalism and experts, the management revolution and the creation of middle managers that promote efficiency. All this is kind of under the umbrella of Taylorism. That's going to be a huge boon for large corporations who are going to use it to grow tremendously during the 1920s. You also have newer technologies, things like the assembly line. Ford will perfect the moving assembly line to allow for the quick and efficient production of cars, and that's going to be then mimicked in other industries as well. You have other technologies like the creation of the lines of credit, and this is going to help spur on consumer growth. And then, even with the growth of the mail service and the expansion of the market outside of just your towns and cities and into the home with the mail order catalog that's pioneered by Sears and Roebuck. So this is going to lead to a consumer revolution in the 1920s that's going to lead to such a large economic growth. Beyond that, you have new medias that are going to be created in the 1920s. So that as part of this Roaring 20s culture is the media of radio. Radio is the number one consumer product in the 1920s, with the creation of commercial radio stations like KDKA in Pittsburgh. You have the growth of a popular entertainment that will help unify the country and start creating more national identity. Once you start breaking down regionalism, once you start getting people that are listening to things in Texas as well as New York, you start breaking down that regionalism, you see the creation of national identity. And that process is a process that we've seen throughout American history. You start from the colonies and the founding of the republic, and then you see the creation of national newspapers and then national magazines that'll help start breaking down some of those regionalist aspects, and then radio will help break it down more, and films will help break it down even more in the 1920s and 30s. And then in the 40s and 50s, television will break down that regionalism even more. And then today, of course, the internet has completely broken down those kind of geographic barriers between different regions of the country. So if we look at the 1920s, you have the radio stations, you have the radio shows, Amos and Andy, Little Orphan Annie, and things of that nature. You also have a growing movie industry in the 1920s centered around silent films. At first, people like Charlie Chaplin and Rudolph Valentino and Lillian Gish would create these silent films that people would flock to their neighborhood theaters or their Nickelodeons to see. And then by the late 20s, you have the filming of The Jazz Singer, which is what we call our first talkie. All right, and our first talkie is when you have sound that is synced up um, with the image. And so this is going to revolutionize film. And then once we get into the 1930s, film will start to colorize with, Wizard of Oz and with Gone with the Wind. All right, if we keep moving on, with the growth of the economy and the consumer economy, you also see the growth of the cities. This is a process we started seeing in the Gilded Age as more and more Americans are moving to the cities. But starting with the Great Migration and World War I, you see war production, and the consumer economy that follows is going to draw even more people into the cities. It helps that on the farms, that the farmers are facing some very severe economic devastation during the 1920s, which is going to push a lot of what would be farmers into the cities. And so by the 1920s, you have a 50% and above urban population in the United States, and it'll just continue to grow in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. All right. As more people are moving internally from the country into the cities, you also have more people moving in externally from countries that had been ravaged by World War I, and this would become very upsetting to a lot of white Americans, especially. They start looking at the types of immigrants, the groups of immigrants that are moving into the United States. This wave of immigrants tended to be more Eastern and Southern European. They tended to be Jewish or Catholic. They tended to you also had a large number of Asian immigrants that were moving into the United States, and this is going to create a backlash against immigration. We've seen it before when you have these waves of immigration with the growth of nativism. And so we're going to see that here with the passage of the Emergency Quota Act in 1921 and the National Origins Act of 1924. The United States will set really very strict quotas on the number of people who could come to the United States and where they could come from. And if you want to understand the difference between those two, it's all about the census state. If you look at the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, the United States based the number of people that could come into the United States off the 1900 census, but that included a lot of Southern and Eastern Europeans. So in the National Origins Act, the United States moved it back to the 1890 census. So they went based on the 1890 census, which had more Northern and Western European immigrants instead of Eastern and Southern European immigrants. All right, you also see this kind of nativism spark because of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, the fear of radicalism in immigrant groups will lead to a first Red Scare. We call it the Palmer Raids because it named after the Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. And A. Mitchell Palmer will go around rounding up what he considered radical immigrants who leaned communist or Soviet or socialist, and deporting them in what will eventually become known as the Soviet Ark. And so here you see the United States responding to World War I with a much more isolationist and nativist understanding of their role and their relationship to the world. 1920s is also known for its debates over whether it's a city or a rural country, whether it's a modern or a traditional country, and what the role of religion and art and science all played within the United States. And so you do see the rise of modernism. In 1913, modernism as an art form officially came to the United States in what was known as the Armory Show. From there, American artists really started to adopt these modernist art forms. People like Edward Hopper and Georgia O'Keeffe will paint modernist paintings from an American perspective. You have writers like the Lost Generation, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, and others who will move to France and other parts of the country or other parts of the world so they can drink and write. And their motto is "Make it new." Right? That's modernism. Make it new. And so these are American forms of art that are really responding to what they consider a shallow consumerist culture of the United States. On the flip side of that, you do have African American artists who are responding to a growing opportunity in Harlem and other cities. Due to the Great Migration, many African Americans found themselves out of the southern part of the United States, out of the restrictive areas of the United States, and they began producing art that really reflected the Black experience of the United States. People like Langston Hughes, who would write poetry, or Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote the book Their Eyes Were Watching God, really promoted the Black experience in the United States. You also have the rise of jazz in the 1920s, which will become kind of the premier American art form as far as music is concerned, and will then go on to influence all American pop music from the 1920s onwards. Women will find themselves fighting your traditional gender roles. Young women especially will develop what we call the flapper, subculture or counterculture in response to what was considered kind of traditional domestic roles for women. Flappers tended to promote their own independence and their own spirit, their own freedom from the world, and they did this by cutting their hair short, wearing shorter skirts, dancing dances that would have been considered too provocative, and various things of that nature. In the classroom as well as in society, you also have this fight between fundamentalism and modernism. Fundamentalism is a movement in religion that tends to seek out fundamental truths in religious texts. So for Christianity, fundamentalism in the United States in the 1920s meant reading the Bible as literal truth. If you think about some of the stories that come from the Christian Bible, things like, God created the earth in 7 days, and Jonah was eaten by a whale, and things of that nature. At various points in time, Christians have read those things differently. Fundamentalists read those as literal truth, and this is going to create a lot of tension in the United States, as people who were more fundamentalist will fight and argue with people who are more modernist, who think that you could read more, the Bible is more, analogous, or as analogies, or more symbolic, and that's going to come to a head in Tennessee when a young science teacher will break the law by teaching evolution, Darwin's theory of evolution, in his biology class, and he'll be arrested. It'll become a national trial called the Scopes Monkey Trial. John Scopes is the teacher. And out of it, nothing's really solved, but it does highlight that division, which I think a lot of us are still dealing with today. We know people who are more fundamentalist in their religious beliefs, and we know people who are more modernist in their beliefs. And so I think that's a fight that we still have in many ways today. If we move on, we look at, this one's really about what caused the Great Depression. During the 1920s, there was a huge economic boom, as we talked about. You had massive companies like the Ford Motor Company growing tremendously. You had large companies like U.S. Steel, Standard Oil, and so forth. And typically, when you look at how reforms happen because of economic downturns or catastrophes, right? When there was the 1893 panic, the progressives came in to fix capitalism, or at least reform it. In the 1929, you're going to have the 1929 panic will lead us into eventually the Great Depression, and that will lead us to the New Deal. And so when you look at the 1920s, you have this kind of interesting perfect storm that shows up in 1929, 1930. You have a severe lack in financial regulation, especially in the stock market. And what This will happen because of this lack of regulation in the stock market. And regulation just means rules. So if you ever get confused what the term regulation means, it just means rules. But there's a lack of rules in the stock market, so people could buy and sell and churn the stock market and create false wealth and false value in stocks that the stock should not be valued that much. You also have a weaker international trade market. We'll talk more about this in a little bit, but after World War One, especially with the growth of tariffs from the United States, the international trade market is going to suffer, and that's going to limit the number of markets that the United States has access to. You also have people overextending their lines of credit. You get those lines of credit that we talked about earlier. Once you buy too much and you've overextended, then you stop buying so that you can pay off your credit. Well, if you stop buying to pay off your credit, then that stalls the economy. All right. You also have an economy where you have a lot of wealth happening in certain sectors, and then certain sectors like the farming sector suffering tremendously. So as those farmers suffer, all right, that creates economic hardship that will eventually lead to banks collapsing. And finally, like I said, perfect storm. You literally had storms that came through, destroying parts of the United States, and creating havoc economically, because storms, that's exactly what they do. Hurricanes in Florida will destroy the real estate market. Floods in the Northeast will destroy industrial towns, right? And the Dust Bowl in the South and Southwest will create economic drought, agricultural drought that's going to destroy crops. So you have these over the period of 5 or 6 years. You have these major natural disasters that will hurt the economy and help push it down into a Great Depression. So the Great Depression happens. You have the stock market crash in 1929. Then you have the run on the banks in 1930, 31. By 32, the Great Depression's in full swing, and we're starting to creep up to about 25% unemployment, which is the highest the country has seen up to that point. And so this becomes, the background for the election of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who's going to come in and say, I'm going to try something. It may not always work, but I'm going to try something. And that's exactly what he does. He's elected in 1932. He'll take office in March of 1933. And within the first 100 days, he and the Congress, the Democratic Congress, will pass 15 major pieces of legislation. That's called the 100 Days Congress. And out of that comes some of the biggest New Deal agencies. Now, we're not going to go through every single one of these, but understand that when you think of the New Deal, think that it has 3 basic functions, right? To provide relief to the poor, so to get money to those in need, so the Federal Relief Administration, right? Get money to people who need money. The second one would be the reform or the recovery of the economy. That's how do we recover the economy? How do we get people out there working again? All right, the Public Works Administration, the Works Progress Administration. All right, these are going to be your kind of recovery acts that are going to push Americans back into work. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, the Civilian Conservation Corps, these are all recovery acts to get people working again. And then finally, the reform. How do you reform the economy so this doesn't happen again? I think this is the longest legacy and the most important legacy of the New Deal would be the recovery or the reform pieces. So, just to highlight the reform pieces over here, you have things like the Glass-Steagall Act and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Those two pieces stabilize the banking sector and make banking a safer bet for people who had lost all their money. The bank runs of 1929, 1930. You have the Social Security Act, which creates a social safety net. So if you cannot work or you get too old, it's time to retire, there's a safety net there for you. The Wagner Act, which will give rights to unions and allow unions to prosper. All right, these are your major reform agencies, and they play probably one of the most important functions. I forgot on this one, the Security and Exchange Commission also comes in to help regulate the financial markets. So these help not only boost the American economy in the 1930s and 40s, but will also help spur on the massive economic growth of the 1950s and early 60s. Now, even though there is a massive growth in the economy, and there is benefits coming out of the New Deal, there are always critics. Right? You have critics on the right and the left. So our left kind of leaning critics, and when we say that, left leaning critics meaning they don't believe the New Deal goes far enough, and then on the right meaning they think the New Deal goes too far. So our leftist critics are people like Father Coughlin and Huey Long. Huey Long is a senator from Louisiana who thought that the United States should adopt what eventually will become known as a universal basic income, but he called it every man a king, right? So the kingfish. Basically, the United States government should give everybody $5,000. All right, and then Dr. Townsend, who thought that the United States government should provide Social Security for the elderly. And then on the right, the more conservative people who thought the New Deal went too far, you have a lot of Supreme Court justices early on in FDR's administration who feel the federal government is overstepping its bounds. And so you're going to see court cases like Schechter Poultry versus the United States that will declare the Agricultural Adjustment Act unconstitutional. In response to these critics, FDR will attempt to pack the court with New Deal friendly justices, but it will fail, and he won't be able to pack the court. Now, out of the New Deal will come a new coalition of workers that included blue-collar workers, African Americans, women, the young urban elites, and others who will come together behind the Democratic Party and FDR. And this is going to completely change American politics for the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, because that New Deal coalition will elect in FDR 4 times. It will then elect Harry Truman. It will then elect JFK and LBJ. So that New Deal coalition will last until throughout the 60s, and then will start to break up in the 1970s. And it's really important when we say a coalition, that means a coalition of voters. All right, groups of voters who come together to vote in a certain candidate. And so FDR is going to bring together this New Deal coalition that will make sure that the Democratic Party dominates American politics from the 1930s through the 1960s. All right, the last little point on this one doesn't really go with what we're talking about here, but as the Great Depression goes on into the 1930s, and then eventually, switching over into World War II, this is going to create a lot of migration amongst different peoples. You have out of the Dust Bowl, you have the Okies who leave Oklahoma and Texas and move to California. You have the Great Migration of African Americans continuing throughout the 1920s and 30s as they move into the urban areas of the North to industrial jobs and out of the more impoverished conditions of the South. All right. Now, this is one a lot of you missed on what thesis is what happened in between World War I and World War II when it came to the U.S. foreign policy. And you all just jump on it like, oh, it's isolationist. But it's really not. If you look at American foreign policy, it's not isolationist. It is kind of America trying to have its cake and eat it too, I think is the term or expression, right? So the American public wanted isolationism, but the American government knew it had to be a part of the world. And so the United States government will help create international financial plans like the Dawes Plan in order to kind of boost up the German economy. Germany during the 1920s suffers through some hyperinflation, some massive inflation where they'd create like the trillion mark bill and stuff like that. The Dawes Plan was a kind of a triangular trade in which the United States would loan money to Germany, and Germany would use that money to pay off the reparations to Britain and France. And then Britain and France would use that money to pay back the United States for its war debts. And so in this way, America and American finance is really boosting the world's economy. And once the crash hits in 1929, and the United States can no longer do that, the world trade and the international trade will collapse. The United States will also host the Washington Naval Conference, in which they will work with various powers throughout the world, including Japan and Britain and others, to limit the amount of firepower and amount of ships that countries could have on the ocean. All right. And this was in response to what they felt was a cause of World War I, which was too much militarization. So trying to reduce the military in order to stop a future war, it does not work. The United States will also be a signer of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which makes it illegal to wage an offensive war. So you can wage war against somebody if it's a defensive war. So if they attack you first, you can attack back. But you cannot be the first to attack according to this international agreement. Of course, people ignore it. And then the United States will create these massive tariffs, and the biggest one being the Hawley-Smoot tariff, in order to kind of restrict competition from international sources for American goods. But America was highly active in foreign policy during the 1920s, just not the way that we will see afterwards, right? Because you think, okay, the United States didn't join the League of Nations, but beyond that, the United States is fairly active in the 1920s. But once World War II rolls around, that part of the United States that wants to stay out, the people who want to stay out of international affairs, will be the loudest heard once World War II starts. So, Japan invades Manchuria in 1931, and that will start this long lead up into World War II. And people like Charles Lindbergh and others will lead a group called America First, which is an isolationist group. They want to keep America isolated from these world affairs. And it is the official stance of the United States in 36, 37, 38, 39 to be neutral, right? They passed the Neutrality Act saying that they are going to stay out of this stuff. But even while you have that, America is slowly inching into conflict with both Japan and Germany. You have the Stimson Doctrine, which came out during the 1930s, in which the U.S. says that no territory gained by aggressive action will be recognized by the United States. All right, so you just told Japan that you will not recognize anything that they've invaded. Then you have FDR in the quarantine speech saying that the world should quarantine Japan for being aggressive in Manchuria and China. All right, so there you go again. You're inching closer to this conflict with Japan. And then on the other side, as Hitler invades Poland and then the rest of Europe, the United States will officially start to get involved with cash and carry and then Lend-Lease, both allowing them to start selling and giving supplies and weapons and things of that nature to the Allies in order to fight off and defend themselves against Hitler. This is all while, quote unquote, staying neutral. As you can see, the reality of world politics at that time meant that the United States was going to get involved, but FDR had to slow roll it in order to make sure that the American people were on board. And of course, once Pearl Harbor happens in 1941, the American people jump on board to go to war against Japan and Germany. Now, the war comes around, and of course, there's massive war mobilization. Very similar to World War I, you have this as a total war. You have the War Production Board and the Office of War Information who are instituting regulations, helping mobilize and make sure that the factories are producing wartime goods, and that that people are buying war bonds. Unlike World War II, though, or unlike World War I, in World War II, you'll see regulation. You'll see, sorry, not regulation. You'll see food stamps, not food stamps. What am I trying to say here? All right, you'll see rationing. Sorry, that's the word I'm going for. You'll see rationing, and you'll see certain products declared illegal. So these luxury products that would use wartime goods, stuff that would usually make wartime goods, those will be made illegal, and then you'll have ration cards. People won't be able to buy, all the sugar they want. They have to ration themselves on that stuff. With this massive wartime mobilization came a lot of opportunities for African Americans, women, Hispanic Americans, and Native Americans. So, for example, in the Southwest, you have the Bracero program, in which the U.S. opens its very tightly closed border with Mexico in order to bring in migrant workers to work the farms in the Southwest. And of course, this will lead to racist tension in the Southwest. For example, the Zoot Suit riots when the U.S. Navy starts attacking young Mexican Americans in L.A. For African Americans, the U.S. FDR signs the Executive Order 8802, which says that the U.S. won't discriminate in its hiring practices. The U.S. government won't. And so you have that Great Migration is still bringing African Americans out of the South and into the northern cities. Of course, very similar to World War I, they're going to find segregation and racism in these cities. For example, the race riots in Detroit in the 1940s. Okay, for Native Americans will find some opportunity in the military as code talkers. These will be military agents who are able to talk and send messages in code that the Japanese and the Germans will not be able to decode. All right, and for the Japanese, right, the Japanese will not find opportunity. Instead, they'll find a lot of oppression. Japanese Americans will be ordered into internment camps through Executive Order 9066, and then that'll be declared constitutional by the court case Korematsu versus the United States. And we read about this in George Takei's They Called Us Enemy. All right, and so while there was a lot of opportunities, women had a lot of economic opportunities during World War II. People like Rosie the Riveter, that propaganda poster like Rosie the Riveter kind of encouraged women to go and work in the industries. While there were those opportunities, many of the opportunities were limited based on America's historic sexism and racism. Now, when we think about when we talk about the United States and American history, it's hard to talk about any American history because in an objective manner, because we are always looking at history through the lenses of World War II. I think a lot of people, when they think about World War II, they think of this as this great war in which the United States went in and stopped evil. All right, and it makes sense if you think of it that way, because first off, you have the Atlantic Charter and Four Freedoms, in which FDR clearly spells out that the United States is fighting for freedom. And then, even though nobody knew about it, a lot of people didn't know about what the Japanese and the Nazis were doing in their war efforts. They didn't know about the Holocaust. They didn't really understand about the rape of Nanjing or anything like that. Once the American public and the world found out, really kind of highlighted this idea that the United States were kind of these freedom saviors that were coming in. Now, that's not necessarily the case of why the United States entered into the war. The United States entered into the war because of imperialist claims in the Pacific that Japan was threatening, and also to help out its imperialist ally in Britain, all right, from falling to Germany and making Germany too powerful. So, kind of had this kind of balance of what the two sides really are. But why did the U.S. win and why did the Allies win? Well, a big part of it is going to be Russia, and Russia using the bulk of its military to push in through Eastern Europe and into Germany and taking Berlin at the cost of 25 million Russians. Beyond that, you're going to see this coordinated effort between Britain, Russia, and the United States at Yalta and Tehran, in which they organize the Second Front of D-Day, in which they organize, how to invade and defeat Berlin and Germany. And then you have, of course, the development of the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb, which will be dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All right, now that doesn't end the war with Japan, but it does hasten it. It does make it come faster. And then once Russia enters into the war against Japan, Japan will surrender, and the United States will accept the surrender. And so kind of putting those together, Russia's military and Russia's power, the U.S. supplies and technology, and the coordination of the Allies, all lead to the victory of the Allies over the Axis powers. After the war, the U.S. will, unlike World War I, in which it kind of skirted around being a world leader and didn't really take that by the reins. After World War II, you're going to see the United States really take full control as a world power. The building of the United Nations and the housing of the United Nations in New York is not a coincidence. All right. Unlike the League of Nations, the U.S. will actually join the United Nations and will use it as a means for pushing its power around the world. You have the U.S. and the other allies holding the Nuremberg and the Tokyo trials and trying the leaders of both Germany and Japan for war crimes. The U.S. will help establish the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to help create conditions that will hopefully not lead to another Great Depression. And then, of course, the end of the war. At the Potsdam Conference, the U.S. and the Soviet Union basically split up Europe, split up Germany and Europe, and create the tension that will eventually lead to the Cold War. All right. I think that's it. Hope you found some things that you didn't maybe remember. Remember to send me any questions you have, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you. Bye.